So I want to be a bit provocative in the first question, because we all, and I'd like Jason to come back on video if he can. I think all academics have a tendency to say it's all a bit more complicated than you think, and let me explain all the complexities of whatever question you ask. So I want to go back to the question that like framed this panel, and I want you to give a yes or no answer. Well, I mean, it's not a yes or no question, but I'll rephrase it so it's a yes or no question. Are asana essential to the practice of yoga? So think if you'd answer that yes or no, and then what is asana in your answer? How would you define asana in your yes or no answer, just in like a sentence or two? Matylda looks like she can handle that, so I could let her go first.
I don't know. Should I go first and should Jason go first? Chronologically. So yeah, I would say from my perspective, yes. I do believe that what actually, Jason is researching, what he's describing, this gradual ascent of asana to the point of it becoming a really complex practice, and a practice that, became a practice kind of in its own right, and a practice that captivated, modern practitioners or across the globe, something that, for example, people like Mark Singleton have written about this kind of transitional period. I think that it wasn't for that, we wouldn't have such interest in yoga practice today. I think this very embodied character of asana practice, and the fact that whatever else is a part of yoga, it can be also, attached to this very physical, very embodied experience is, So this is a long answer, and short answer, yes, absolutely. It's critical for yoga.
Fabulous. And Jason, maybe if you just turn your sound on, then we can hear your answer. Would you say that asana is essential for yoga, and how would you define asana?
Yes, as I said, I think it is essential to any form of yoga that involves meditation or breath control, because one has to sit in a specific way to do those practices. And then, of course, it became an important, it was an important auxiliary in Patanjali's yoga for that reason. And then it became an important auxiliary of Hatha yoga, as I argued. And as I say, it's a posture suitable for the yoga, in other words, for achieving the higher aims of yoga, which in most cases, if meditation and pranayama are involved, is to achieve a profound meditative state, generally referred to as samadhi, which is usually seen as essential for achieving liberation from samsara, from the cycles of worldly existence. So yes, I think it's essential.
Fabulous. That was very clear. Okay, I'm going to take one of the questions in the Q&A, and do feel free to add ones either for one of the speakers or for both. But this is the second question, which is, in each of your opinions in turn, do you think there should be certain rules on how to teach asanas in order to honor the yoga philosophy, or just in general, do you think there should be rules? I'm thinking about Matylda's normative, saying there are normative ways of doing this, but within that, do you think there should be guidelines of what's acceptable and what's not for any reason?
Yeah, so should I also begin the answer? I think this is a very this is a question that will require a very long, I don't even answer, but I think a discussion. This is the topic of discussion, how much rules we require and what kind of rules we require. And I think this is something, nowadays with this kind of, discourse between modern postural yoga and the emerging, post-lineage approaches to yoga, this is a question often asked, like, how many rules for controlling the practice, for conceptualizing the practice and actually for saying what yoga practice is or isn't, we need. And so that I think there are a few things here to consider. So one thing might be kind of the more intersubjective social factor related to, you know, issues of, you know, non-harming and empathy, etc. So we do need certain rules of conduct, right? And of course, these rules of conduct might depend exactly on how a particular, you know, group of practitioners, how a particular interactive situation would be structured. And you know, we know that certain pre-modern ways of teaching yoga, of teaching yoga postures, have become kind of, you know, outdated in contemporary setting, and we need to rethink these rules of how we teach, you know, how we interact with others. But this is one. So this is one aspect in which we do need rules. The second aspect of the second role of rules is that it actually, you know, gives certain boundaries to a system of practice. So if we want to practice, the question is to what extent, if we want to practice yoga and still feel that there's a continuity with, I don't know, yoga tradition or yoga history with what we're doing, how many constraints we need on that. Because, you know, yoga might become, for example, more interdisciplinary. We may add new forms of movement to yoga practice, maybe, you know, from other, you know, disciplines. And the question is how much we can, you know, transcend the traditional constraints of what yoga is for it to be still called yoga, right? And these are all questions, these are all issues to be considered. This is nothing I have a definitive answer to. But yeah, I mean, you know, I am a fan, so to say, of systemic approaches. And I do, and as such, I do believe that in whatever system we might have, and here we'll be talking about, you know, a system of practice itself, and most importantly also a social, organizational and intersubjective system of practitioners, rules will always emerge. It will never be totally random. So in this sense, rules are kind of inevitable, because, you know, there will be a way to regulate this community and this practice that will just emerge naturally out of the dynamics of this community and this practice. So in this sense, yeah, we need rules, but also rules we kind of appear inevitably, I would say.
And I guess it might be context specific. I wonder if Jason might want to comment more on, are there certain rules in order to be faithful to historical texts, or are there any certain rules of how to teach the asanas that you see repeated over and over again in the way that the asanas are presented in the texts you look at?
Yeah, thank you, Suzanne. I suppose a lot of what Matylda presented about modern yoga and what she spoke about then are the very things that we really don't see elaborated in medieval yoga texts. And it sort of made me, while Matylda was giving her presentation, it made me realize just how different our research universes are, where we inhabit completely different worlds, really, and think about different questions. So I wonder who it was who suggested that we should talk to each other. I think perhaps we should be kept apart. But anyway, seeing that we're here, I would say there are okay, in the yoga text, the very thing that we're often missing is how yoga was taught, you know, what exactly the guru did. And it's the same for asana. You know, we don't really know whether asanas were held for short periods of time, for long periods of time, whether the guru gave instructions about the breath, how long they practiced for, all that sort of thing. It's a question, you know, one would like to ask, but what's the point of asking it when there's when the text wasn't written to answer those questions? I suppose the closest thing, you know, in terms of how a guru and student should conduct themselves is that in some texts there are passages on what is a good guru, what is a bad guru. I suppose the idea being that if you know, the student is looking for a teacher and he or she should look for these various good and bad qualities. Yes, but And as Matylda said, perhaps you could infer that a guru should follow the behavioral codes of yoga, such as non-violence and truthfulness and so forth. But otherwise, I think yoga texts were designed to provide different information, and perhaps the community in which yoga was taught, or the particular lineage or sect, really determined, how it was taught, who could practice it and who could teach it and so forth. And they were not really codified in that information wasn't really put in the text, because the yoga texts just explain the practice. It's an auxiliary practice, often for people of many different religions. And so they would obviously be governed by their communities and their own social and religious environments, I suppose, in that regard.
And before moving on, I just want to come back to it. This question refers to are there rules for honoring the yoga philosophy? Are there ways that would be inappropriate, considering what the dominant understanding of yoga philosophy might be? Ways of teaching asana that would be inappropriate, considering that.
Like, if I may, to my perspective, any particular, group of practitioners or lineage or tradition of yoga might have some kind of a system, let's say, of philosophy that they will call, of course, the yoga philosophy. But from kind of, an ethic perspective of a researcher, we'll see that, there is not really, it might be difficult to talk about one yoga philosophy. I mean, we might have certain aspects, certain concepts that are, for example, recurrent. I don't know. Let's take the concept of yamas and niyamas that reappear in different contexts and kind of, for example, have been adopted by contemporary communities of yoga practice as well, right? So, but I do believe that the way these concepts are interpreted today also can be very idiosyncratic, and so I don't know if there's a way of honoring them properly that would be absolutely independent of the context. So maybe Jason can also comment on that once again, so the original let's say ethical guidelines or whatever other conduct guidelines that we might have, for example, in the ancient texts that let us kind of create this reverie of the philosophy of yoga. They've been produced also with very specific social contexts, right? And also, some of this context we might know from research. Some of this context we might be oblivious to, as Jason suggested. So, we would be fooling ourselves, I think, assuming that our interpretations and our applications of these rules today have a whole lot to do with the original. I mean, with the original applications and interpretations. So I would say. So in this regard, I will be very pragmatic in the sense that, every yoga community should work on their own, rules and guidelines and kind of, the interpretation of a yoga philosophy, whatever it is, and not worry too much, whether it's true with the original, the transcendent, because it's always dependent on the immediate context. Social context and the context of the practice, right?
And I guess maybe Jason could comment on the extent to which the texts you look at maybe say this practice is inappropriate in one text and another text says this is the best practice. Is that something you've come across, or that this practice will lead you to your goal and this practice definitely won't, and it might be the same practice that will and won't in different texts? Does that happen much?
Well, some texts are polemic, and so they teach a practice and then criticize other traditions and their practices. But I see that more as a selling point. They're sort of saying how good their own particular practice is and why it's better than the oppositions. And I would also say that the behavioral codes that we get, such as the non-violence and truthfulness and so forth, I suppose, as Matylda said, they are pragmatic. They're pragmatic, I think, within systems of Ashtanga yoga where there are auxiliaries, because they contribute towards achieving the goal. And so in that sense, I think they transcend social context. They transcend the communities. They, because they have this sort of practical value in terms of the practice of yoga, they make the practice of yoga effective, in other words. In terms of so the question, or the original question, was about yoga philosophy. Well, I often think the physical traditions succeeded because they didn't teach much philosophy. They certainly taught a little bit about the yogic body, but they focused on practice and technique. And I think they really left the philosophy and the ethics, as I said before, to the communities or of the practitioners, and that would have changed from one instance to another. So that's why we see in some cases hatha yoga being described as an auxiliary practice. Whether one's a Buddhist, a Brahmin, or a Kapalika, one can achieve liberation through the practice of yoga. So in other words, they would continue following their own religious tradition and living in their own social circumstances. And the practice of yoga wouldn't impinge, wouldn't profess a philosophy that would impinge upon that. It just says, do these postures, do these breathing techniques and meditation techniques, and you'll achieve liberation in life. And that was perhaps the appeal of them. They could bring about liberation more quickly than some of the other religious traditions that, say, in the case of Orthodox Brahmanism, you would be liberated after death, or in other cases, you might have to kill yourself to be liberated, such as the Shaiva Siddhanta traditions. Well, if you don't want to do that, you could practice hatha yoga and become immortal in your body. So they offered an alternative for a lot of people.
Sounds like a much more attractive alternative for a lot of people. We've got a really interesting question, which kind of ties into some of your last comments, Jason, about gateway practices. And it's addressed to Matylda. This is from one of the panelists, in terms of contemporary practitioners. And do you think that asana continues or is the dominant gateway practice, and then they do pranayama, mantra, etc., or are you seeing that change, or is there no particular pattern? And I also think this might be interesting for Jason to address in terms of gateway practices in the texts he encounters. Like, why would someone pick up one of these bodies of teaching? How would they encounter it? What would be their gateway to what is taught in one of the texts, as much as we can tell, given we have only fragmentary historical evidence?
So I cannot really competently answer this question because I do not have statistical data. So I'm unable to tell what currently what is the number of people who engage in asana practice as the let's say initial yoga practice. For what number of people we have who start off with, I don't know, for example, pranayama practice or some other kind of let's say meditational or contemplative practices that are referred to as yoga. So I am interested. So what interests me and what I study is postural practice, and of course it is also the question is how and this of course would encompass like postural yoga lineages, post lineage communities, but also those casual practitioners who jump into an asana class twice a week. So so I cannot say whether there is a trend. Because yes, as I said, I don't have large scale data to say that, but Yeah, definitely. I mean, definitely asana practice is a very popular and attractive one. So that's basically all I can say in this regard.
Well, I would say that in terms of the text, asana, you could consider asana a gateway practice, because it's usually there, whether explicitly said or not. It's usually needed in order to do the other practices. As I mentioned in my talk, if you're going to meditate or do breathing exercises, you have to sit. So there are some systems that formalize that, such as Patanjali's Ashtanga Yoga. It's one of the early auxiliaries, and there are other systems that don't mention it, but it's obviously a preliminary. It's a prerequisite, if you like. It must be there at some point. I think in practice, though, of course, the guru. So the other interesting difference between how Matylda is thinking about these questions and myself is that Matylda is, of course, thinking about classes, yoga classes, and people practicing together, and there being a teacher at the front of the class and so forth, and would contain experienced and not so experienced students. Well, as far as I can tell, with the pre-modern situation, I'd say it was more a one-on-one situation. I mean, the hut, for example, that a yogi is supposed to practice in is barely big enough for one person. So I imagine that he or she's doing a lot of the practice by themselves, and so the guru probably turns up and gives individual instruction, then goes away and leaves the practitioner to it. And so I'd say in that situation, the guru would, be able to tell what is needed in the beginning. That would be the gateway. The guru would provide the gateway practice, but still, I would say posture would have to be part of it, but it would be more tailored to the students' requirements.
That's a great answer. So we've got another question from the panelists about kind of continuity and change. And so considering for Jason's case, if you could think about a kind of concrete example and some asana specific names or practices and how they've changed over time. And I think as far as Matylda's concerned, this might be, I know that she's worked quite a lot on the Krishnamacharya tradition, so maybe if you could think about how a particular pose or series of postures has changed in different lived contexts, and maybe a bit of the different linguistic meanings of those changes, if I'm not putting you on the spot too much. Maybe Jason can go first.
That'll give me time to think about it.
Oh, you both want time to think.
Okay, Matylda, you'd prefer if I go first?
I mean, I can. I think I can produce something. Maybe.
The suggestion of chair pose.
So I was actually thinking about something different. So, like, for example, one thing that was interesting for me to, let's say let's say Trikonasana, right? The triangle pose, which of course the standing poses are a big part of the modern posture yoga practice in all this post-Krishnamacharyan lineages. And looking at, for example, let's say the Vini yoga of Tighe Vijayasekara, and Iyengar yoga and Ashtanga yoga of in the tradition of kaivalya Joyce, and looking at this one little pose, we can kind of see how the original was kind of modified depending on what understanding of movement in asana and what asana is and how it works. These three different reformers, let's say, of modern yoga had. And of course, we can see, I don't know, Krishnamacharya performing in his old photographs in some of his books, performing in Trikonasana, which I'm sure many people here in the audience are familiar with, which he's kind of, this legs slightly apart, slightly bent to the side. This one posture becomes, when, for example, translated into Tika Vidya Sikachar, it becomes simply this kind of lateral movement with extended legs, which and I don't have photographic material to show now because photos would be really helpful. But so, for example, there might be this, like, for beginner practitioners, this practice of entering into and going out of the pose, which is basically associated with a repetitive movement, laterally, away to the side and down and back, and away to the side and down back, which is also very strongly coordinated with breathing. Like, just basically in Vini Yoga, a very important aspect of the yoga practice is coordinating breath with movement, extending the breath, and, for example, using the spread arms to extend the breath. In Iyengar yoga, when you see, because Iyengar doing the very same position, his legs are spread apart to an enormous difference. His chest is all huge and puffed up, and he's just kind of majestically spread out like this humongous starfish performing this posture. And you can see that his understanding of asana practice, kind of spreading the legs, spreading the arms, and extending the chest, and feeling the chest with basically with sentience, with attention, with the spirit is present there in the pose. And then you go to see how this same posture is performed by Ashtanga practitioners, and very often might very much go back to these photos of Krishnamacharya, this tiny spread legs, kind of do it for 5 breaths, change the posture, kind of a part of this more dynamic sequence. So if you look at these postures in back to back, technically they're the same posture. When you look at them without this template, without knowing it's the same posture, there are huge differences between them, and you can also see that this difference reflects just the general concept of postural practice of these 3 founders of these 3 lineages. On the other hand, for example, I know people in contemporary yoga milieux who kind of start to look at this posture from more kind of physiotherapeutic and kind of biomechanical perspective, and then might think, actually, what does this posture do to different muscles? What happens if I put a weight in one of the hands, for example, and do this posture with weights? So there might be some other changes that emerge through kind of opening up the canon to new influences. So I don't know if this example helps, but
no, I think that's great. And you would say that kind of each different way of doing Trikonasana also somehow encapsulates the different nuance on the yoga philosophy that each community is developing.
This is something I've argued kind of extensively in my book, so I don't want to brag too much about my book, but if somebody wants specific details, I go to a lot of
go to Matylda's book.
Yeah.
And do you have any thoughts now, Jason? You've had a little bit of time to think.
Yes, nothing particularly profound. I mean, I think we have examples of poses of the same name being described differently. In some cases, they're completely different shapes, and that can be explained by one tradition reinterpreting, a posture from another, or an earlier posture from another tradition, or vice versa. But when the names are changing, often the shapes and the forms persist and continue. They just go by different names. So the obvious example is that Padmasana has many different names. In some traditions, it's called Virasana. In others, Paryankasana and so forth. I would say there are some interesting cases, such as Danyarasana, the bow pose taught in the Hatha Pradipika, which has 2 shapes attributed to that name. And in the Hatha Pradipika, the earliest description and mention that we get of that pose, it's sort of drawing one foot. You're in a sort of Dandasana type of position, with the body's in an L-shaped position with the legs extended, and then you pull one foot to each ear alternatively. And then this pose or Dhanurasana was later taught in the Hatha Yoga Samhita as a backbend, completely different, unrelated shapes as far as I can tell. And then, of course, we also, when you read the corpus as a whole, you also get more information about some poses that changes the way you think they may have been practiced. So, for example, in one of the manuscripts that we looked at for the Light on Hatha project of the Hatha Pradipika, there was a commentary in the margin. The commentary said that Dhanurasana that's described in the Hatha Pradipika of pulling each foot alternatively to the ears like a bow action should be done continuously. So in other words, it was a moving posture. Whereas in the earlier phases of yoga, Hatha yoga as well, you would generally the assumption is that postures are more static at that point, and that movement comes in later and really becomes, in some cases, a salient feature of certain systems, such as the Hatha Abhyasa Paddhati. A lot of the asanas have repetitive movement, but that's an early case, Dhanurasana, where it may have been a moving posture back in the 15th century.
Well, that's interesting, the way there's always changes, and it's not necessarily in the direction we think all the time. So to keep on track, I'm going to ask us all to thank our two panelists, which have led to a really interesting discussion, I think, at the end. So thank you both very much. And I'll hand back over to Chris for the next session.